Okay, so good evening everybody and welcome to Campion Hall in Oxford for Father Martin Darcy Memorial Lectures 2022, Preparing for the Moral Life by Professor James Keenan, SJ. I'm Father Nick Austin, and as Master of Campion Hall it's my pleasure to welcome you here, both those in person and those joining us from around the world for the beginning of this year's 8 lectures in the series. Campion Hall is the Jesuit permanent private hall in the University of Oxford. We're celebrating our 125th year this year. And the Darcy Lectures were established back in 1976 in honour of Father Darcy, a former Master of the Hall, and really to bring the best of Jesuit scholarship from around the world to a wider audience. The first Darcy lecturer, I believe, was the well-known philosopher Frederick Copleston, and other Darcy lecturers have included the liberationist John Sobrino, the Cardinal Avery Dulles, the mystic William Johnston, people talking on law, on sociology, on Eastern religions. And perhaps a special worthy of note this evening, as our topic is in theological ethics, is to single out Jack Marnie's Darcy Lectures of 1982, which became the making of moral theology. When Oxford University Press published their Handbook of Theological Ethics, they singled out the making of moral theology as one of the 7 books that shaped the discipline. And James Keenan himself was the person asked to review that book for that handbook. And I'm hopeful, I believe, that this year's Darcy Lectures may prove just as significant for the shaping of theological ethics in 2022, 30 years later. We're delighted to have a partnership with Georgetown University Press, based at our sibling Jesuit institution in Washington, D.C., who have established a series to publish the Darcy Lectures, and last year's Darcy Lectures by Patrick Reardon on the Common Good will soon be the first in that new series, and James' book will be soon to follow. James Keenan is the Canisius Professor at Boston College, where he's also the Vice Provost for Global Engagement. He recently received the John Courtney Murray Award for his service to theology. And his publications have spanned the history of moral theology, Thomas Aquinas, HIV/AIDS prevention, university ethics, and many other fields as well. A recent outspoken article in Theological Ethics takes on the problem not of clericalism alone, but of hierarchicalism in the church. Equally important as his writing has been the way he has fostered the discipline of theological ethics. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that no one has done more to shape the new generation of moral theologians on all 5 continents. The founder of Catholic theological ethics in the World Church, he's fostered especially young students and young moral theologians from around the world. And I myself was lucky to have Jim as my doctoral supervisor, and I think I can say that one of James' great gifts is his ability to help theologians find their own voice. We're looking forward today, Jim, to hearing your voice and your vision of what Catholic theological ethics can be in the 21st century. So it's a real delight and real pleasure to have you here. Thanks for coming over from the US, and we're really looking forward to the series beginning today.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate this. In 1982, I was ordained a priest, and shortly afterward, I went to the Gregorian University to do a licentiate and a doctorate, studying with both Joseph Fuchs and Klaus Stemmer. In 1987, at the end of my studies, Jack Mahoney's published his magisterial work, The Making of Moral Theology. Reading that book, I learned about the Martin Darcy Memorial Lectures, and from that time, I sincerely hoped that one day I too would be invited to give those lectures. Now, 35 years later, I confess how honored I am to be delivering them. Thank you, Nick, for this opportunity. Over the past 10 years, I have been developing my own account of the history of Catholic theological ethics, which builds on and develops from Marnie's groundbreaking account. Happily, that work, A History of Catholic Theological Ethics, will be launched by Paulus Press in early June. These Darcy lectures derive from another inquiry that I began about 5 years ago by asking what prompts human beings to act morally. The first of those investigations were provoked by an invitation I received from David DeCause, who invited me into a project entitled Conscience and Higher Education. These lectures are the fruit of that first and subsequent inquiries. I have entitled these lectures Preparing for the Moral Life. They are an attempt to investigate what we need to know, not only to be and live morally, but also to teach and share with others what they need to know as well. They are in 8 stages. This evening, grief, vulnerability, recognition, conscience, the call of discipleship, grace and sin, the virtues and the Beatitudes, and mercy and the world church. While I believe the lectures are rooted in the research of contemporary philosophers and theologians, the style of each is meant to be engaging. So now, grief. Let me offer 3 governing insights to help you follow my argument. First, the disciples were gathered in the upper room from the death of Jesus to the Pentecost, moving initially from grieving to evangelizing Jesus as risen Lord. There in the upper room, their experiences of grief led them to become even more vulnerable to Jesus, and were subsequently incited to recognize him as risen Lord through the Holy Spirit. Believing that vulnerability and recognition are the preconditions for the moral life, I have developed elsewhere. I propose to connect all 3, grief, vulnerability, and recognition, in the next 3 lectures. Thus, just as these 3 are, as I will argue, constitutive for the birth of the church, they are too constitutive for the birth of the moral life. Second, remembering that the ars moriendi, or the art of dying tradition, was often invoked to exhort others to pursue the ars vivendi, or the art of living, I singularly want to begin at the end of the moral life, that is, with death. But rather than propose that we look forward imaginatively to what one's exemplary deathbed experience ought to be, I want instead to look back at how we grieve, and as Judith Butler recommends, tarry there. Third, I hope that by giving grief its due, that we might raise up in these lectures a theological anthropology for the moral life that is far more affective, relational, connected, vibrant, and life-giving than we normally encounter in theology. Though starting with grief might be unsettling, I also hope you find that in preparing for the moral life, grief is a splendid point of departure. So, grieving at Pentecost. On Tuesday, May 19th, 2015, I received word that my best friend, the Hong Kong Jesuit Yu Sing Lucas Chan, had died of a heart attack, having collapsed on a bench in the corridor of the theology department of Marquette University. Trying to get to his office as he was returning from his daily early morning workout at the university gym, Lucas gave up his last at 6:45 a.m. before any of his colleagues arrived. He was 46 years old, the epitome of healthy living, and his death was overwhelming for all of us, his colleagues, friends, and family. His funeral at Marquette would not be for at least a week, but on May 24th, I was scheduled to preside at the Sunday liturgy at St. Peter's Parish in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I have worked for now nearly 20 years. That Sunday would be Pentecost Sunday. Facing Pentecost, the so-called birthday of the church, the celebration of the Spirit descending into the midst of the gathering in the upper room and sending the disciples out, inspired by and with tongues of fire, I asked, how could I bring my grief to that celebratory liturgy? I had known sudden death before. My brother Bob died during an early morning seizure of epilepsy when he was 26 years old and I 27. That day, June 2nd, 1980, changed the lives of all of us in my family. From Bob's death, I learned the importance of grieving with others, and that grief alone is a dreadful, painful practice. Grief is meant to be shared, whether in shiver or at a wake. In preparation for that Sunday liturgy, that Sunday Pentecost liturgy, I began asking myself, what were the disciples of Jesus doing in the upper room on the eve of what we now call Pentecost? Certainly, they were there in fear, as is often noted. And in time, they also began waiting for the Spirit, as Luke tells us. But I also began to see that they were there simply grieving. In fact, I believe that their grieving was constitutive to the process of the coming of the Spirit and of their recognizing Jesus as risen Lord. Their ability to subsequently witness to Jesus, the very message of Pentecost, was prompted by their grieving. The Scriptures, I think, or I believe, or I hope, bear this out. In the later so-called long canonical ending of Mark's Gospel, we learn that Jesus rose early and appeared first to Mary Magdalene. The 11 were gathered in the upper room, where they were, we are told, mourning and weeping. Mary Magdalene knows they are there and reports to them that Jesus is alive, but they do not believe her. Again, 2 more come to report to them in the upper room that they met Jesus on a road, but again they do not believe. Later, we do not know how much later, Jesus himself comes to the upper room. Now they recognize him. He rebukes them for not believing the reports, then commissions them to preach and ascends. In Matthew 28, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary arrive at the tomb and see the angel who tells them not to be afraid, that Jesus has risen, and to hurry to tell his disciples. They were afraid, but filled with joy when Jesus appears to them, and then they clasped his feet and worshiped him. In Luke, everything happens in one day. We hear that on Sunday, 3 days after the death of Jesus, the women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women, discover the empty tomb and encounter the 2 men in dazzling clothes who tell them that he has been raised. They run to the disciples in the upper room, and the grieving disciples do not believe them, though Peter runs to the tomb and is amazed by the tomb being empty. Then the encounter at Emmaus is described, where the 2 disciples are looking downcast. These 2 have already left the upper room, where they heard the reports of the women, and then of those who went to check the tomb and found it as the women had reported. Jesus calls these foolish and slow of heart to believe. In their shared grief, they still do not recognize him, as he tries to open their eyes by recounting from the Scriptures. Finally, in the breaking of the bread, they recognize him and rush back to the upper room to tell the 11. As they enter the room, the 11 tell the 2 from Emmaus that the Lord has risen and appeared to Peter, and then to the 2 make their report. Unlike Mark, Luke reports that the 11 believe that Jesus has been raised before he appears. When Jesus does appear, he extends to them his peace, eats fish, and tells them to stay in Jerusalem because he is sending upon them what my Father promised. He walks to Bethany and then ascends. In the Acts of the Apostles, after the ascension of Jesus, the disciples return to Jerusalem and immediately go again to the upper room, where we are told the 11 were staying, together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers. Luke makes a point that they are there for several days. When the Pentecost occurs, again it seems as they are in the upper room. In John, everything, including now the Pentecost, happens in the same day. Mary Magdalene discovers the empty tomb, rushes to report the missing body of Jesus to Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved. They rush to the tomb and then return to their houses. Mary returns to the tomb and is grieving outside the tomb, distressed that not only has Jesus been put to death, but now even his body has been taken away as well. The gospel refers to her weeping 4 times in this pericope, with both the angels and Jesus asking, "Woman, why are you weeping?" Jesus approaches her in her grief and confusion. Like the 2 in Emmaus, she does not recognize him, but then he calls her by name. She clings to him. He tells her to stop holding on to him as he is ascending to his Father, and then commissions her to tell the disciples. Jesus later that day goes to the disciples who are gathered in the upper room, breathes on them, which Bruce Forter holds as the culmination in one day of the resurrection, ascension, and Pentecost. Jesus returns a week later to the upper room to reveal himself to Thomas. Their grief was not an obstacle to their eventual capacity to recognize Jesus, but rather the passageway to the recognition. Through their grieving, they became more vulnerable to their love for Jesus, that they could eventually recognize his risen presence. These words, grief, vulnerable, and recognition, are here inextricably linked to the Pentecost story, and in particular to the role the Spirit plays in our lives. The phenomenon of grief is, I think, the willing openness to the loss of a loved one. I'll say that again. What I think of grief is the willing openness to the loss of a loved one. During that Pentecost, I discovered that my grief was a form of love. In fact, whenever I touched that grief, I encountered the love that connected me to my friend Lucas. Entrance into grief is not solely an encounter with absence, but with presence as well. The more one feels the presence of the love, the deeper one feels the loss, and yet the gulf of love remains. Like the upper room itself, it is a place of vulnerability. When I think of the disciples, Mary and the others in the upper room, I think it was there that they gathered to grieve. There, after all, was where they celebrated the Last Supper, a meal that Jesus initiated on the night before he was to die, though also as a meal to be repeated after his departure. It is good to remember right after the meal that they fell into sorrow in the Mount of Olives. Mark tells us that Jesus was greatly distressed and filled with sorrow, as does Matthew. Luke helps explain the tiredness of the disciples when they fall asleep by saying it was due to their sorrow. There they returned after the Mount of Olives to the burial in the tomb. When the 12 are gathered in the upper room with Mary, they are grieving with one another. They are going certainly out of fear after this terrorizing arrest, passion, and public crucifixion of their leader, but they are also there precisely to grieve. Their grief is not like, however, some contemporary check-in. They are not consoling one another by saying, "Are you okay? Mary, how are you doing? Peter, how are you handling it?" I don't think it had all that nicety. I think instead that they were just narrating to one another about the love that they experienced from Jesus. In their grieving, they wanted to hear from Peter, Mary, the mother of Jesus, the Magdalene, from John, and the others, stories of how Jesus loved each of them. In hearing these narratives, I think they were consoled. In their shared grief, they gave one another to experience their love for and from Jesus. And it was in that space that first Jesus and then the Spirit found its place to enter in the upper room. Into the loving grief of the upper room, the Spirit found her place. In a similar way, every Christian funeral is a replay of the upper room. When I preside at a funeral, I enter into not primarily the presence, but the felt absence of the person loved, the raw, emotional, gut-wrenching experience of love exposed because the loved one has died. Those who believe the promise of the resurrection encounter it not by negating grief, nor by transcending it, but by entering it. The promise is not a quick fix imposed by rather something believers recognize as they grieve, but rather something believers recognize as they grieve. Through grief, we experience and eventually recognize the promise of the resurrection. The felt loved with the now deceased remains as the bridge through grief. Now, a passage that I call Mining the Gap of Grief. Several weeks after my brother Bob died, I received from a Jesuit, Stanley Marrow, a beautiful letter of condolence with these words from Dietrich Bonhoeffer: "Nothing can fill the gap left by someone we love, and we should not attempt to find anything. We must simply endure and hold out." That may sound very harsh at first, but at the same time it is a great comfort, because as the hole that he has left remains unfilled, so the connection with him remains. It is wrong to say God fills the gap. God doesn't fill it at all. Rather, God leaves it unfilled, and in this way God helps us to maintain our true communion with our loved one, even though it is painful. Bonhoeffer wrote these words on Christmas Eve 1943 to his closest friends Renata and Eberhard Bethge, as he lay in prison in Tegel, later to be executed on April 9, 1945. These words of Bonhoeffer were an enormous consolation to my family. We experienced precisely in the gap of grief the way to maintain our true communion with our loved one. I have come to believe that grief reveals human vulnerability, which is, I will posit later, not our weakened nature, but rather our capacious ability to be connected. Our capacious ability to be connected. That's what I think of vulnerability. Grief, which arises from the separation of being connected, is the exposition of our underlying vulnerability. Thus, in the Christian funeral, we do not deny the pain of death, but rather touch precisely the loss through grief. I think that is how the disciples recognized Christ, not in spite of the grief, but through it. They dared to feel the loss of Jesus, to share the love he had for them, and they for him. They grieved. Their grief made them more aware of their own vulnerability to Jesus, to the love of God, and to the working of the Spirit. Their grief is integral to their recognition of the resurrected Jesus. Let me add, they grieved his death even after the resurrection appearances. Mary Magdalene grieved that she had to let go of the risen Jesus and could not hold him again. Hanoli Metangere captures her grieving and remains and endures. In fact, the iconography at the Magdalene shows her almost always alone, minding, if you will, the gap, waiting for when she will finally be reunited with him. The disciples of Emmaus grieved that he disappeared after the breaking of the bread and returned to it to encounter their grief, the gap, and the love. They returned to the breaking of the bread again and again until they too would be reunited with him. Peter and John assuredly looked for Jesus time and again on the beach. It was that grief that gave them the conviction to preach Jesus raised. But they, like Paul in Philippians 1, longed for death so as to be reunited with the one they lost on earth. Peter grieved until he was crucified, and Paul too until he was executed. Let us not think that the appearances eradicated the grief, but rather gave grief a new energy, a new reason to hope through grief. They mind the gap. Let us turn to the Scriptures and see a little bit more on this grieving in the Scriptures. We all know the shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept, John 11:35. In that pericope, please note that Jesus does not begin to weep when encountered by Martha or Mary, but rather when he literally is brought to the tomb and confronts the reality of Lazarus as dead. Grief exposed Jesus' vulnerability to Lazarus, and that is revealed to us in the very next verse, quote, "Then the Jews said, 'See how he loved him.'" Though some say that grief is a price of love, I say instead that grief is a form of love. It is not an effect of love, it is an act of love. It's constitutive of it. Jesus grieving for Lazarus is entering into his love for Lazarus, experiencing painfully, vulnerably, the love they had until he raises him. Through grief, the Spirit leads us as vulnerable in the face of death, through love, to hope. Another significant biblical text on grieving is the second Macarism of the eight Matthean Beatitudes. Blessed are they who mourn. In his book, The Ten Commandments and the Beatitudes, Biblical Studies and Ethics for Real Life, Lucas Chan opens up the Beatitudes by following the insight of John Climacus that the Beatitudes are a ladder of ascent. In this way, we see that each Beatitude makes possible the next one. We can only ascend the ladder one step at a time. Chan notes, therefore, that the overarching importance of the first Beatitude, where we start by turning our gaze on the poor in spirit, who are the most poor of the poor, economically deprived and socially alienated. Turning to the second Macarism, blessed are they who mourn, Chan notes that we are to turn our gaze on those who mourn. Reading the Beatitudes along with the exegetical claims of Hans-Dieter Betz, William Davies, and Dale Allison Jr., as well as the theologian Gerald Vann, Chan notes that the mourners are not those grieving their own condition or loss. Chan writes, "The object of mourning is not so much one's own suffering or sins, but rather the concrete experience of poverty and suffering encountered by community members, that is, the poor in spirit." Chan continues, "Mourning points to an other-oriented moral value. It is about a certain disposition that genuine disciples have with one another, such that if one suffers, the other mourns as well." He adds, "Mourning is then the ready subordination of one's own comfort and well-being to the suffering of others. Blessed are those who mourn is therefore about those community members who so recognize the poor in spirit that they mourn the condition of the poor in spirit. We will see later how Butler suggests an invitation to grieve for the other, which is not far, I think, from the second Macarism. Similarly, it is important to note in the Scriptures that mourning always encounters a response of God. Mourning is always a sign of the human's hope to be visited by God. Just as Jeremiah consoles the mourners of Zion in Sirach 48, so God turns mourning into joy in Jeremiah 31, like a mother who comforts her child in Isaiah 66. Thus, quote, "The Lord who is close to the brokenhearted responds to those who are crushed in spirit," as the psalmist says in Psalm 38. Grieving for the other's loss, their alienation, suffering, or death is the beginning of the beatitudinal response of the call to genuine discipleship, that is, of responding to the poor in spirit. It is what the Spirit recognized in the upper room and it is what precedes all else in the ladder of ascent. For the Christian, it is not the denial of suffering and death, but the encounter with loss and suffering of another. Entering into their loss, we are led by the Spirit, as the disciples were led, to not only recognize the risen Christ, but to unabashedly preach him. The sixth self. Between the deaths of Bobby and Lucas, I also experienced an advanced melanoma and learned a bit about the notion of the sixth self by the American philosopher and pragmatist William James. During that time, in the midst of I guess it was about 14 months of interferon treatment, during that time I was asked by Brian Massengale, who is the president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, to give the plenary address called Impasse. He thought I was going to talk about bishops. I spoke about the fact that I was living then with an advanced melanoma that gave me a 50% chance of survival over the next 5 years. After extensive surgery, I went through a fairly brutal regime. Despite the sustained and compelling depression and fatigue, as well as the nightly sweats and the low-grade and sometimes spiked fevers that I got from interferon, I was experiencing a new and reconciled peace in my life that I never knew before I became ill. I remarked how I found myself experiencing something akin to William James' twice-born person. In my recovery, I was discovering a newfound ability to appreciate the present, to attend to those whose lives were far more in jeopardy than my own, to appreciate more deeply the humanity of the people I met, to sense the abiding presence of the Lord, to be far less trapped by my own fears, and to stand in hope, not despite, but because of the ambiguity with which I lived. Though these sentiments were still in their early stages, all of this was very reconciling, and I found that the more I identified with others' suffering, the more able I was to bear my own. James distinguished between the healthy soul and the sick soul. The healthy soul is a person who is able to pursue her or his own desires. The sick soul has conflict, struggle, and frustration throughout life and knows a great deal about evil and sin. Because of this striving, only the sick soul can become a twice-born person. This birth resonated with my own experience. James writes, "The process is one of redemption, not of mere reversion to natural health, and the sufferer, when saved, is saved by what seems to him a second birth, a deeper kind of conscious being that he could enjoy before. You can hear in the background, 'Oh, happy fault.'" I know that many here online, in this room, have had similar experiences of the sick soul, whether from disease, alcoholism, drug addiction, betrayal, censure, job loss, a divorce or abandonment, or the death of a spouse, a child, or a loved one. I am deliberately trying to tap here into another precarious experience like grief, that is, your experiences of the sick soul as well. I think the key to life is the ability to live cognitively, emotionally, and spiritually with one's own precarity, while being in union with others in theirs. I do not think that Peter, the Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Thomas, or John ever really left their grief behind. In fact, Paul himself so resonated with the death of Jesus that therein he found his freedom and the promise of life. I think for them, as for Bonhoeffer, the gap that death causes was never really closed. I think that is why Paul, in Romans 8, assures us that we are led by the Spirit precisely in our sufferings. We groan through our sufferings into becoming the children of God, and this groaning occurs through, as Paul notes, the present time in Romans 8:22. He adds, "The Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans." Whether in grief, in suffering, or in the sick self, we experience the Spirit leading us, accompanying us, expressing for us and from us what we yearn and hope for. In the rawest moments of human vulnerability, the Spirit gives us hope by his own actions. Where we are precarious and vulnerable, the Spirit finds a place within. So a more existential and relational encounter with death. In the 16th century, a period when Christian piety greatly developed, ascetical manuals on the preparation for dying proliferated across Europe. It is hard to underestimate the extent to which this form of meditation became a constitutive part of the Christian spiritual and moral life. Its thesis was simple. By preparing for death, one could learn how to live. The tradition of the ars moriendi, the art of dying, was the first lesson to the ars vivendi, the art of living. In a way, this explains in part my reason for beginning this project with a reflection on grief. For just as earlier traditions on the art of moral living began with an anticipation or a memento of death, so too do I. It may be jarring, but it has been long the necessary first step. In his significant work, Patience, Compassion, Hope, and the Christian Art of Dying Well, Christopher Vogt begins by noting how, in the present order, we avoid talk of death, and even have so medicalized death that we have robbed it from view, from being seen or witnessed. Vogt takes us through 4 major texts to consider how rich the ars moriendi tradition was. Erasmus's Preparing for Death, William Perkins' Salve for the Sick Man, Robert Bellarmine's The Art of Dying Well, and Jeremy Taylor's Rule and Exercises of Holy Dying. These texts go from 1533 to 1651 to give you an idea of the span. Each of the texts is an invitation to consider not only what right dying looks like, but also at the same time to anticipate or imagine oneself on that very deathbed. In a way, the texts proffer an exemplar, and for that reason, Vogt provides in another chapter Luke's account of the death of Jesus as such a worthy model. For me, what Vogt describes is an antidote to what Ernest Becker captured in his award-winning work, The Denial of Death. That is, the contemporary flight from engaging with our human mortality. In his foreword to that work, Sam Keen prepares us for Becker's claims by noting, quote, "The terror of death is so overwhelming, we conspire to keep it unconscious." Keen adds, "The basic motivation for human behavior is our biological need to control our basic anxiety to deny the terror of death. Human beings are naturally anxious," he writes, "because we are ultimately helpless and abandoned in a world where we are fated to die." Becker says it even more uncomfortably. What does it mean to be a self-conscious animal? The idea is ludicrous, if it is not monstrous. It means to know that one is food for worms. This is the terror, to have emerged from nothing, to have a name, consciousness of self, deep inner feelings, an excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression, and with all this yet to die. Of course, as your memories or recollection turns back to Becker's work, you probably are also thinking of the famed Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who so domesticated death that she offered our trajectory toward accepting it to 6 separate steps. As Keen notes, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Ernest Becker were strange allies in fomenting the cultural revolution that brought death and dying out of the closet. At the same time that Kubler-Ross gave us permission to practice the art of dying gracefully, Becker taught us that awe, fear, and ontological anxiety were natural accompaniments to our contemplation of the fact of death. As Becker, Kubler-Ross, and Keen remind us, unless we face death, we will never live. When Christians hold up the ars moriendi tradition, we anticipate it in the confidence of faith and hope. But this can be misleading, as the cultures we live in that counsel But this can be as misleading as the cultures we live in that counsel us to avoid thoughts of death. Alan Verhey reflects on this in his The Christian Art of Dying, Learning from Jesus. He warns against the tendency to commend death so as to subdue it. Rightly, Verhey argues that it is not healthy nor an honest motive. The threat of death is, as he and I think, terrifying. Like Christian grief at a funeral, we face and feel the impact of death, but we enter the experience as believers, sometimes coming out of it looking as haggard as Piero della Francesco's risen Christ. Hopefully you can see then I am trying something different than what we find in the anticipatory Ars Moriendi exercises. That tradition is not far from the memento mori tradition, in which mementos of death, like someone's skull, is kept at hand, whether in Hamlet considering poor Yorick, or St. Jerome, or the Magdalene, who often, like Hamlet, are seen holding skulls as mementos of death. Invariably, the practice reminds us that we are food for worms. Ars Moriendi, like the memento mori, are, however, imaginary exercises. They are dependent upon the imagination that can make a very lovely deathbed experience to happen. But grief is neither an act of imagination, nor is it a solitary event. It is existential. Grief is not also a one-time affair, but an ongoing one. Following Bonhoeffer, it's a lifelong one. And in this sense, it is an awakening, or, as I like to say, an epiphany of the gap. Grief is not an imaginary encounter with death. It is death interrupting life. It is love exposed raw. It is a space that we enter and feel transformed by the loss of and yet the presence of love. As Becker seeks to challenge our culture's easy efforts to obscure death, I too want to reject the so-called psychological advice that proffers those who grieve to get back on track and put grief behind them. I have learned instead to tarry with grief, and I cannot tell you how many friends respond to my comments on grief as liberating. They find helpful my talking on grief as a form of love, as a life-giving pathway to enter into grief without shame and without losing themselves in despair. And yet they find the invitation an honest one. They stand boldly on the brink of the gap and embrace Bonhoeffer's admonition to not fill it, but to trust in God as the witness to it. In a recent essay on lessons learned about grief in light of COVID-19, entitled, quote, "We must learn to look at grief even when we want to run away," Sunita Puri, the palliative care physician, writes, "I don't believe in moving on and finding closure. This language distills the messy complexity of grief into tidy sound bites and asks people to leave something behind, bury it, or lock it away. The challenge for my patients and their families is the challenge for all of us. Can we instead move forward with grief? Can we find a way to integrate loss into life, to carry it with us, to move forward with grief? Moving forward with grief is what those who gathered in the upper room did. I also turn to grief because it exposes the theological anthropology that I want to pursue in these lectures. I think grief reveals the breadth and depth of the human capacity for relationality, and it is for this reason why I suggest that we tarry with it. It is for this reason, I think, that C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed is so remarkably disquieting. It conveys how he grieved the dying and death of his wife, Joy. I saw it on Broadway performed. And as he's standing by the bed and she's there in the bed and he's talking and ruminating about all his anxiety, hesitancies, he doesn't understand, why is this happening, someone from the audience screamed out, "Embrace her!" Without apology, Lewis conveys his grieving and we are left speechless for some. But can we not move beyond that speechlessness? Like those who try to help the grieving find closure, there are those who believe that grief is too messy for philosophical reflection. The philosopher Michael Cholby disagrees. As I was writing this, he published this book, Cholby, Grief, A Philosophical Guide, that came out in November of 2021. In this first philosophical examination of the topic, Grief, A Philosophical Guide, he argues that the importance of grief deserves better attention. He writes, "The centrality of grief to the human experience makes it ripe for philosophical investigation, so the paucity of philosophical attention it has received is lamentable." Though Melissa Kelly reminds us in her classic work on grief and pastoral ministry that there are many matters over which we grieve, Cholby focuses, as I have here, exclusively on the death of persons and investigates the questions: for whom do we grieve? He asks, do we grieve for the one who has died, for ourselves, or for the relationship itself? He answers, we grieve for those in whom we have invested our practical identities. That is, we grieve those who come to play crucial roles in our aspirations and commitments, indeed in how we understand ourselves and in what we find valuable or worthwhile in our lives. Furthermore, he outlines 3 descriptives about the way grief functions. First, grief is a series of affective states. While recognizing Kubler-Ross's contribution, Cholby adds that his series is not reducible to 5 stages, nor limited to any particular order, nor exclusive of the emotions he proffers. He goes through these 8 different emotions. His thoughts resonate with Sundar John Bhupalan, who insists on grief as a profound, multidimensional experience in his illuminating work, Memory, Grief, and Agency. Cholby names the second descriptive as a kind of emotionally driven attention. He explains, grief responds to the death of others not by immediately disclosing their importance, but by motivating us to take notice of their deaths and interrogate how those deaths matter to us. That attention leads us to the gap where we find not only the death of the other, but the relationship. In grief, we attend to the loss, trying to comprehend it in its fullness, just as those did collectively in the upper room and those do today at Shiva and funerals. It is not simply something that just happens to us. It is something that we do. I want to add here that mindful of Bonhoeffer's admonition, when we Christians grieve, we are mindful of the presence of God, who witnesses to our own faith and hope that our relationship with the other is not lost because the other is not lost. For this reason, our attentiveness in grief is a matter of faith and hope, precisely in the tangible, emotional, and spiritual experience of the death of a loved one. Finally, Cholby provides the third description. Although grieving is not a process we can dictate, he writes, it is nevertheless an activity that responds to our choices and actions and that has a discernible aim. Grief is then a process, a kind of attention, and a purposeful activity. In sum, he writes, grief's object, what grief is ultimately about, is the bereaved individual's relationship with the deceased, a relationship that invariably has been transformed by the latter's death. Cholby's griever has agency through the emotions, through the attention, and through the activities. Nonetheless, grief is disruptive. Cholby writes, grief can be seen as corresponding to a narrative disruption in our lives, and he adds, it can be a pivotal juncture in the story one makes out of one's life. He proposes, therefore, that grief can lead to narrative building, that grieving has both backward and forward-looking dimensions. He adds that it can be seen as an activity of revising one's existing life narratives in light of the death of one of that narrative's principal characters. Cholby concludes that grief leads us to ask the larger question, who shall I be in light of who I have been? Turning to grief as a resource, then, for the moral life. Obviously, I am not the first to turn to grief as a resource for ethics, though before doing research on the topic, other than the Ars Moriendi tradition, I thought I was. Indeed, in 1992, like Keene, Jerome Miller critically noted that much of contemporary therapy brought grief out in the open so as to subdue it, so that we could, quote, undergo it without being ultimately upset by it. Later in 2003, Bruce Rogers Vaughan wrote an essay to recover grief as a resource for theological reflection. He rightly noted, what we direly need today is not grief recovery, but the recovery of grief. In 2004, the philosopher Judith Butler wrote Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence, as a response to the United States response to the attack of September 11th. It's a very powerful read. She believed that the U.S. was missing an opportunity to redefine itself as part of the global community. While noting that President Bush announced on September 21st that after 10 days as a nation, it was time to replace grief with resolute action, she posed instead, if we are interested in arresting cycles of violence to produce less violent outcomes, it is no doubt important to ask what, politically, might be made of grief besides a cry for war. She argued instead that we should tarry with grief, to remain exposed to its unbearability so as to make grief into a resource for politics, not to be resigned to inaction, but as a slow process to develop a point of identification with suffering itself. Butler sees grieving as not in itself negative, but rather as productive of new social relationships. Grieving opens our eyes to a new appreciation of our relatedness. It challenges our self-understanding, our autonomy, and our understanding of our independence. Butler wants us to appreciate the experience of being decentered by precarity and loss, to understand how we are understood when we experience loss and grief. The evocation of supreme sovereignty or even self-sufficiency, she argues, is delusional, though a disturbing default. Grief teaches us that we are not sovereign but relational, more than we actually know. She writes, if my fate is not originally or finally separable from yours, then the we is traversed by a relationality that we cannot easily argue against. Or rather, we can argue against it, but we would be denying something fundamental about the social conditions of the very foundations. Warning us against blind flight, she writes, our political and ethical responsibility are rooted in the recognition that radical forms of self-sufficiency and unbridled sovereignty are by definition disrupted by the larger global processes of which they are a part, that no final control can be secured, that final control cannot be an ultimate value. I like to think that grief provides us, as it did for the disciples at Emmaus, as it did for the Magdalene in the garden, an epiphany, disclosing at once who Jesus is and who we are, and how we learned love through the one that we lost. That image of epiphany helps us, I think, appreciate all the more what Butler is suggesting as grief provides a foundation for our political lives. Grief displays, she writes, the thrall in which our relations with others hold us, in ways we cannot recount or explain, in ways that often interrupt the self-conscious account of ourselves that we might try to provide, in ways that challenge the very notion of ourselves as autonomous and in control. Grief allows us to see the fragility of the narrative we are trying to build. She writes, I tell a story about the relations I choose, not only to expose somewhere along the line the way I am gripped and undone by these relations. My narrative falters, as it must. She adds, let's face it, we're undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something. She concludes, one does not always stay intact. One may want to or manage to for a while, but despite one's best efforts, one is undone by the memory of the field. As the disciples who sought one another in the upper room knew, grief is not privatizing, nor does it return us to the solitary self. Luke might not have said this, but Butler did. Grief, she writes, furnishes a sense of political community of a complex order and brings to the fore the relational ties that have implications for theorizing fundamental dependency and ethical responsibility. Besides grief revealing to us how embodied, interdependent, and relational we are, and how fundamentally problematic an ethics invariably is that tries to imagine the self as singular, grief also reveals, as Butler sadly suggests, those who do not matter. She writes, "I am as much constituted by those I do grieve for as by those whose deaths I disavow, whose nameless and faceless deaths form the melancholic background for my social world." In 2008, she investigated the issue of lives as grievable or not in the frames of war when life is grievable. In 2015, she returned to them again, asking which lives are disposable and ungrievable. By looking at the ungrievable, she sees that we can find whose lives matter, whose lives do not matter as lives. She recognizes that the ungrievable have ways of grieving one another, that the ungrievable gather sometimes in public insurgencies of grief, Black Lives Matter. But to say that one is ungrievable is to say that there is no present structure of support that will sustain that life, which implies that it is devalued, not worth supporting. When we consider that there are the ungrievable, then we must ask what it will take for us to recognize their lives as grievable. But in order to get to that recognition, we need to discover our own vulnerability first, and therein to see how it so deeply depends on our recognizing human dignity. Those two themes, vulnerability and recognition, are the topics for our next two lectures. Still, I want to close by saying that when it comes to grief, Christians have a lot more to say than being undone by it. Fittingly, I conclude with the words of my friend Yu Sing Lucas Chan. 3 days before he died, on May 12, 2015, he presided for the first time at the Jesuit Community Liturgy at the close of the academic year at Marquette University, having just finished his first year of university teaching and having led the prayer service for the commencement. He had already published 2 books and about a dozen peer-reviewed articles, but now he was preaching these prescient words on John 16, 5-11. I'll just quote the last 2 paragraphs to conclude. In the gospel, Jesus was saying farewell to his beloved ones. Likewise, it is supposed to be a very sad moment. Yet he turned the situation into one of great hope for his disciples. For if I do not go, the advocate will not come to you. Of course, from a human earthly point of view, it may be better still to have Jesus around instead of letting him go. Why are we so afraid of separation? I think it is very true when we see our beloved ones leaving us or we leaving them. Whenever I preach in a funeral mass, I always remind myself that if without faith, death would only mean eternal separation. Yet with faith in the Lord, the deceased, the beloved one, is actually closer to us than before, as he or she is now next to the Lord, who was always around to teach, stand by, and walk with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that very stimulating beginning to the Darcy Lectures this year. Please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question here. And if you're online, please do enter a question into the chat. Perhaps I can begin with a question, Jim. When we look at different approaches to theological ethics, one of the first questions is, what do you begin with? And, is it an axiom or a principle? Is it an analysis of human action? Is it the idea of conscience? Is it an understanding of human happiness? You've deliberately begun with a human experience, a painful human experience. What's the significance of that as a starting point for the whole endeavour of theological ethics, in your view?
Let me comment and highlight why I think your question is so significant. Because I've thought about this many times. I did a book called Moral Wisdom, and I began it with love. And it's a book that's used in universities around the country, much to my chagrin. But I thought of Charles Curran, who in his Catholic theological ethics starts with the church, because he says that for Catholics, the scriptures, the tradition, the sacraments are mediated within the church. Others may want to turn to the experience of Jesus, a prayerful experience of an encounter with Jesus. And yet others who start their work will start with the Bible itself, with Revelation, as a way of expressing. Sometimes in the history of the church itself started with the tradition as the point of departure. A different position, I would say, than what Curran is suggesting with starting with the church. These points of departure, I think, are really key. I'm trying to do something different than what I've done in the past. By doing something on grief, we're coming out of COVID. We have a war, Ukraine. We've been seeing, I remember that the eve that Biden became president, he held a memorial service. It was our first time in the United States that we mourned the dead. We hadn't done that in any public ceremony in the country while President Trump was in office. But on the eve of him taking office, the first public act he did was to lead us in grieving. I think that grief has been overlooked. This is maybe a temporary beginning, but I think that we're ready for grief. The Cholby book is just out. Most of these people who are writing, this John Wu Paulin is a theological ethicist. Do you know him, John? He just did this book on memory and grief in Eastern and South Asian traditions, and how it actually affects their communities of faith and their way of ethically proceeding. So there are a number of people who are turning to grief as a point of departure. I'm, with my background in history, thinking of the Ars Moriendi tradition, but I think that this is a radically different point of departure because it's looking at the interpersonality, the actual experience that we have, that we mine, not something we imagine, but that we don't really understand because we're going through this gap in a particular way that needs accompaniment and that needs a way for us to encounter hope with God's witness and with Christ's accompaniment. So I'm thinking that preparing for the moral life in the 2020s, grief is a good point of departure. But I would not recommend it as an institutional preface to the beginning of moral life. I would say that, for me, I would say that the encounter with the Lord, as revealed, is a great point of departure. Somehow, I'm developing later in this, after I do grief, vulnerability, recognition, and conscience, then the remaining four are very different from this. This is leading up to that. Then the very first one of the next four is discipleship. And I would say that I'd be most interested in the notion of discipleship as a point of departure for an institutionally based theological ethics. What I'm interested in, and what I'll disclose more next lecture, is what we need to do in order to develop within our students a readiness for the discipleship. I think until they understand what vulnerability and recognition and conscience really are, they're not going to understand the call of Christ in discipleship. So in a way, these four lectures are a propedeutic for the foundations that I'll be developing with and then those are the basics, I think, what I'm going to do. Discipleship, grace and sin, the virtues and beatitudes, and then finally mercy and the world church.
Thank you.
That was not a setup question. I didn't know he was going to ask that, but thank you.
One of the great things about the Darcy Lectures is the opportunity for an ongoing question about a topic of substance in depth. So please do enter into this conversation, do begin your questions as we journey through these 8 weeks together. Tim.
Thank you so much. In the course of my ministry career, I encountered a rather sad situation of a couple where the wife passed away. The husband, the widower, was in his 80s and really struggled to come out of his initial experience of intense grief. He was in a care home, and the staff around him was so concerned that he was not moving through those Kubler-Ross stages sufficiently quickly that they began, indeed, out of their concern, they began to medicate even. And so there was a jarring clash there of paces, if you like. Mm-hmm. So my question is, just beginning with your wonderful ethical observation, how can we begin to scale up or apply that to real life therapeutic contexts where the culture is screaming out, move through, and some of our staff, out of the very best intentions, are encouraging us to move through those at an established pace? How do we begin to apply some of these lessons to real life contexts like that?
Good. So just to summarise for people online, if you didn't catch all of that, Dr. Tim Howells is asking what happens, how do we as a culture deal with the question of the pace of grief with our current tendency to want to move people quickly through the stages so they can move out of grief?
I begin the next lecture with another setting. You know, just as this one I began with the setting of the upper room, the death of Lucas, a funeral. I will begin the next one with Mary, the mother of Jesus, John, and the Magdalene at Golgotha, as saying there we encounter vulnerability. Imagine rushing them from Golgotha. Imagine the ignominy of rushing them after this horrendous execution, this wicked, extraordinarily violent crucifixion, and then just moving them away. And then I think you sense how much respect is owed to those who mourn, and how violent it is to move people through their grief, to rush people through their grief. The most common experience that I get from people when they hear what I have to say about grief is they feel released from the shame they feel, the social shame, when they're afraid to say, I'm still thinking about my wife. And somebody says, it was a year ago. And in that, but it was a year ago, they hear so much shame that they're slapped back into the room. And I think that this Puri's insight of how can we bring grief forward is a constructive way to allow people to move forward without rushing them forward, to allow them and to accompany them in that. But I do think that I keep encountering people who say that, you know, years later, they're still mourning. And people, and as Bonhoeffer points out, you know, Bonhoeffer wrote, knowing of his death, and he wrote to his Eberhard Bethges, his best friend, clearly, and he's writing to him so that he continues to grieve for him, because he wants that gap to be mined. So I just think that we have to, I'm doing this in part to use the Darcy Lectures as a platform, as a moral corrective to the pietistic rubbish that is accommodated by our social economic structures that want us to move on and not want us to tarry. I think that this tarrying with grief is a good exercise. And I know that people who do this ministry are realizing after these years in particular what that's like. Just think, you know, years from now about trying to rush a Ukrainian through what they're experiencing now. We're glimpsing the horrendous violation of these people. How unsacred it would be, how sacrilegious it would be to rush them through a way of living through these experiences. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Professor John Beckman.
Thank you, Jim. That was a fabulous lecture. I'm very grateful to you for it. And your comments got me thinking about how so often, at least in North American culture, you find out that someone said they don't want a funeral, or it's going to be a private funeral. Can you say a bit more about this, what you take this phenomenon to be about? A kind of even a rejection of funerals, or such a widespread thinking, oh, I don't want to go, that's such a unpleasant experience. What do you think, can you say a little bit more about what you think is going on with that phenomenon?
As a priest, I have to say I feel privileged officiating at a funeral. I think that many priests feel that, who really are, they realize that it's an opportunity to allow for grace to enter into this grieving process. But my encounter with people is that often afterwards they'll say, I was so afraid that you were going to tell me that I should be hopeful or that I should be something. I just wanted you to respect my mother or my father's grief. I wanted you to respect the loss that has happened. I wanted you to acknowledge the death that we're here for. And I'm not a liturgist. John Baldwin is a dear friend of mine. And I have other liturgists who are good friends, but, I think that the way, and I'm not saying he does this, but I think that the way contemporary people are interpreting liturgical events for funerals sometimes look like we're pushing the resurrection down their throat in a way that Jesus never did that to anyone, even when he was visiting them in the upper room. I think that we have to allow people to grieve, and we have to, though, provide them a way that they can identify the hope of the resurrection as the grace that comes by minding the gap. So I think that many people are afraid of liturgies that would deny the pain, that would try to wipe away the tears, that would try to subdue by saying believe, when they are believing, but they're grieving. And what I'm trying to say is grief is compatible with belief, that grief is compatible with hope, that grief is compatible with the news of the resurrection, and to make us more attuned to grief so that we can minister the good news of the resurrection in a way that can be encountered rather than assaulted. So I want to acknowledge, since this is being taped, that I think John Baldwin would say the same thing.
Yeah. We're coming to the end now, but just perhaps one question from those online. They're interested, especially Luis Orlando and Martin Pendergast and Antonio from Berlin. They're interested in this idea of grief as a foundation for social ethics, for political life, Ukraine, Russia. Can you just briefly answer why grief is so important in that regard?
Well, see, I think that what I'm trying to say is that grief is so social that's how the disciples came together, finally. It was not just through the death of Jesus, but they're grieving over the death, that they gathered in that upper room. Like when I go to Jerusalem, I have never been to Jerusalem, but when I go to Jerusalem, it's that upper room that I want to go to. That's where they continue to gather. That's where the Spirit, that's where the risen Lord appeared. That's where the Last Supper was celebrated. In that space, the church was born. So I think when Butler, that's why I make this remark at the end, Luke doesn't say this, but Butler does, I'm trying to say that I think that this is compatible with what the way that the church emerges from the upper room. I'm thinking that, and I think this is what Butler's fury at George Bush was was that the United States did not learn to grieve, to understand this violence before, and instead went to war, that it preempted what needed to be, so that as a society, we could understand how we could subdue violence rather than engage in it. So I think that invariably, grief leads to new partnering, new networks, new communities. And I'm trying to say that grieving in the upper room led to a place that Christ could appear and that the Spirit could descend. And I think that it is what helps us make communities. It's what helps us to realize how much we love.
Thank you very much, Jim. On that note, I think we'll end today. Thank you so much for beginning us with your trademark combination of compelling argument and resonant experience, which is so helpful for theological ethics in our moment today. Please do join us next week for the second lecture, which will be on recognition. Vulnerability, the third one on recognition. Same time, Tuesday next week. Have a very good evening, everybody.
Thank you.